70 years old with gray hair and calloused hands, she stood in the middle of the city's most luxurious restaurant, listening to her daughter-in-law say bluntly to her face, "There's no place for someone like you here." Dozens of eyes in the room were fixed on her. Her son, the one she had worked 3 shifts to support and educate, sat silently, not saying a word. But they didn't know one thing. They never knew. This restaurant, every chair, every chandelier, every inch of ground beneath their feet belonged to her. And tonight, she wouldn't leave. Please like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. And remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts. I have replayed that night so many times in my head that I sometimes wonder if I dreamed it. But then I feel it again. That sharp, clean sting in my chest when Vanessa looked at me across the dining room floor and said what she said. And I know it was real. Every single second of it was real. It started with a phone call. That was how it always started with Ethan. Not a visit, not a letter. A phone call, usually rushed, usually squeezed between something more important. His voice carrying that particular impatience he had perfected over the years. The kind that told you he was already thinking about the next thing before you'd even finished talking. Mom. Just that. Not hi, Mom. Not how are you feeling, Mom. Just Mom, like a stamp on an envelope. Ethan, I said. I was in my kitchen, standing at the counter with a cup of tea I hadn't touched yet. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and the light outside was the color of old honey. I remember that detail, the color of the light, because it was the last genuinely peaceful moment I had for a long time. "We're doing dinner Friday night," he said, "to celebrate. You know I made partner." I did know. He had made partner at Caldwell in Marsh 3 weeks earlier, and I had sent flowers to his office. Sunflowers, his favorite when he was a boy. He had not called to say thank you. I knew this because I had checked my phone more times than I wanted to admit. "That's wonderful, Ethan," I said. "I'm so proud of you." "Yeah, so we're doing it at Hargrove's, Friday, 7 o'clock. You should come." Hargrove's. I almost said something then. Almost. But I let it pass because I had gotten very good at letting things pass. "I'll be there," I said. "Good." And he was already gone, that quick click of the call ending before I could ask anything else. "No, are you doing okay, Mom?" "No, is it too far for you to drive?" "No, do you need anything?" Just the click. I stood there in my kitchen for a moment with the dead phone in my hand and that untouched cup of tea steaming in front of me, and I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself what I had been telling myself for years. He's busy, he has a lot going on, this is just how he is. I was very good at making excuses for my children. I had been practicing since they were teenagers. I spent the rest of the week trying not to get too hopeful. Hope, in my experience, had become a dangerous thing to carry when it came to Ethan and Ryan. I had learned that the hard way too many times. Looking forward to a birthday dinner that got canceled an hour before. Saving a seat at Christmas that never got filled. Wrapping small gifts that sat in a closet for months because nobody came to pick them up. But this was different, I told myself. This was a real invitation. He had called me himself. He had said you should come. And maybe it was a step. Maybe Ethan had gotten to a place in his life where he was ready to be different with me. People changed. I had seen it happen. I had to believe it could still happen with my own children. I bought a new dress. Navy blue, long sleeves, a simple cut that I thought was elegant without trying too hard. I had my hair done on Thursday afternoon. A woman named Gloria at a little salon 2 blocks from my apartment who always talked too much about her ex-husband and made my hair look better than it had any right to. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror that Friday evening before I left, and I thought, "You look fine, Margaret. You look like a woman who belongs anywhere she decides to walk into." I believed that when I said it to myself. I want you to know that. I had not always believed it, but I did that night. I should have known what was coming. I should have felt it, the way you sometimes feel weather changing before the sky shows you anything. But I didn't. I walked into that evening wearing hope like it was armor, and I didn't find out until much later just how thin that armor really was. Hargrove sat on this corner of Whitmore Avenue and 5th, and if you didn't know what it was, you might walk past it. The exterior was deliberately understated. Dark stone facade, brass door handles, a small sign with the name in simple gold letters. No neon, no menu in the window, no attempt to advertise itself to anyone who wasn't already supposed to know it existed. Inside was another world entirely. Low lighting that made everyone look like they were in a painting, white tablecloths that were changed between every seating, walls paneled in dark walnut wood, and the kind of quiet hum that meant the acoustics had been engineered so that even a full dining room felt like a conversation between two people. I knew the restaurant the way I knew my own reflection. But I walked up to that brass door on Friday evening like any other guest, because that was how I had decided to play it, quietly. I was always quiet about the things that mattered most to me. The hostess at the front was a young woman with dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a black jacket. She had the practiced neutral expression of someone paid to be pleasant without being warm. I gave her Ethan's name. She looked at her list, looked again. "Yes, the Hayes party," she said. "They're already seated. Right this way." I followed her through the dining room, past tables of people in expensive clothes having the kind of conversations that sounded important and probably weren't. I spotted Ethan before I spotted anyone else. He had his father's posture, straight and certain, the kind of physical confidence that always looked like it cost him nothing. He was laughing at something, his head thrown back, and for just a second he looked like the boy I remembered, the 12-year-old who used to laugh at the dinner table until milk came out of his nose. Then he saw me. The laugh stopped. Not all at once. It faded, like a light being turned down on a dimmer. He straightened in his chair and glanced sideways at Vanessa, and that glance told me everything I needed to know if I had been paying a different kind of attention. Vanessa was already looking at me. She had a way of looking at people that stripped them down to their inconvenience. I had noticed it years ago, the first time Ethan brought her home, but I had told myself I was being uncharitable. Over the years, I had found out I was not being uncharitable at all. I was being accurate, and I had simply refused to trust myself. She was wearing a cream-colored dress, and her hair was down, and she looked genuinely beautiful, which had always made hating what she did to my son somehow harder, and somehow worse at the same time. Ryan was there too, seated across from Ethan, his wife Diana beside him. Diana was quieter than Vanessa, but she followed Vanessa's lead the way water follows a drain, and I had never been able to reach her either. I raised my hand in a small wave and started toward the table. Vanessa stood up, not to greet me. I understood that the moment she did it, the way she moved wasn't the movement of welcome. She walked toward me with her glass of white wine in one hand and that expression on her face, the one I can only describe as a door closing. She stopped about 3 feet in front of me, close enough that we were clearly talking to each other, far enough that she hadn't actually come to meet me. Around us, people at nearby tables were doing what people in restaurants do, pretending not to listen while listening completely. "Margaret," she said, just the name. No hello, no nice to see you, just my name, pronounced the way you'd say problem. "Vanessa," I said. I kept my voice even. I was very good at keeping my voice even when I needed to. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said, "because I think it saves everyone time." She tilted her head slightly, that practiced gesture that was designed to look like consideration. "This dinner is for Ethan's colleagues and close friends, people from the firm. It's really not the kind of thing that's appropriate for everyone." I heard the word appropriate. I heard what she was doing with it. "Ethan invited me," I said. Ethan was being polite. She said it without any particular cruelty. That was almost the worst part. She said it the way you'd explain a minor logistical error to someone. "The parking is on the second level, not the first." Ethan was just being polite. "I see," I said. "There are some lovely places nearby," she said, and she actually gestured with her wine glass, toward the door. "More casual, probably more your speed." More your speed. I stood there in the middle of Hargrove's dining room and felt those 3 words land on me. I felt the weight of them. I felt the years behind them. Every Christmas call that was 3 minutes long, every birthday card that arrived unsigned, every conversation in which Vanessa had found some small, precise way to remind me that I was not the kind of person who fit into the life my son had built. I felt all of it. And then I felt something else. Something that had been sitting very quiet and very still in the center of my chest for a very long time, waiting. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like clarity. The specific crystalline clarity that comes when you have finally been pushed to the last possible edge and you realize, with complete calm, that you no longer have anything left to protect by being careful. "All right," I said. Vanessa blinked. She had expected something else. Tears, maybe, or flustered apology, or the small, shrinking retreat she'd probably seen from me enough times to expect it by reflex. "All right," I said again, and I turned. I walked back through the dining room, and I heard behind me the sound of Vanessa returning to the table and the low murmur of the table reassembling itself around her return, and probably someone saying something in a low voice that made the others laugh quietly. I walked to the front of the restaurant. The hostess looked up. "I'd like to speak with James, please," I said. She paused. "I'm sorry." "James Whitfield. Tell him Margaret Hayes is here." The pause was longer this time. Then she picked up the small phone at the host stand. "I want to tell you what happened in those 3 or 4 minutes while I waited, because it wasn't nothing." I stood near the entrance to Hargrove's and I watched my son's dinner party from across the room. Ethan had not gotten up. He had not come after me. He was sitting in his chair with his shoulders turned slightly away from the direction I'd left, and I watched him reach for his glass and take a long drink, and I understood. He had known. He had known what Vanessa was going to do, or something close to it, and he had let it happen. My son had let it happen. There are moments in life where you learn something about a person that you already knew and refused to fully know, and the learning of it is its own kind of grief, separate from the thing itself. I stood there by the entrance and I grieved that, quietly, in about 30 seconds. Then I put it somewhere I could deal with later because that was also something I had gotten very good at. Ryan glanced over at me once, just once, from across the room. He had his father's eyes, lighter than Ethan's, and for a second I thought I saw something move across his face, something that might have been discomfort or guilt or the faintest shadow of the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder watching old movies on Sunday nights. Then he looked away. That was Ryan's gift, looking away. I heard footsteps and turned, and there was James Whitfield coming through the door from the back hallway. And the moment he saw me, his face broke into a genuine, unguarded smile. The kind of smile that nobody performs, the kind that just happens. James was 53 years old, heavy through the shoulders, with gray at his temples, and the kind of hands that said he'd started his career actually cooking before he'd moved into management. He had been the general manager of Hargrove's for 11 years. In those 11 years, he had reported to me. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, and there was warmth in it, real warmth, the kind you can't manufacture. "I didn't know you were coming in tonight." "Spur of the moment," I said. "You should have called ahead. We would have prepared—" "James," I kept my voice low. "I'd like table 4, please." He didn't hesitate. "Of course. Right away." Table 4 was in the center of the dining room. It was the largest table that wasn't reserved for private parties, a round, beautifully set table that sat 6 comfortably and had a view of the entire room. It was also, and I was counting on this, clearly visible from the table where Ethan's dinner party was seated. James walked me to it himself. He pulled out my chair with the kind of care that felt like ceremony, and when he did it, the room noticed. The way rooms notice when the texture of something changes. I felt eyes following us across the floor. I heard the quality of conversation shift slightly, the way it does when something is happening that people can't quite categorize yet. I sat down. I watched James snap his fingers once toward a server, a specific gesture that the staff at Hargrove's knew meant best service, immediate, no questions. And within 40 seconds, there was a water glass, a menu I didn't need, and a small amuse-bouche I hadn't asked for, but that arrived the way it always did when James knew I was in the building. And then I looked across the dining room. Vanessa was staring at me, not with her closed-door expression this time, with something I had never seen on her face in 11 years of knowing her, confusion. First, genuine, unguarded confusion. The confusion of someone whose reality has just shifted without warning. Then something else working underneath it, a recalculation happening behind her eyes, pieces clicking together in an order she hadn't anticipated. Ethan was staring too. His wine glass was halfway to his mouth, and it had stopped there, arrested in midair, because he had seen James Whitfield, Hargrove's general manager, the man who had been photographed twice for the city's business journal, the man whose name appeared on every professional citation this restaurant had ever received. Walk Margaret Hayes to a table with the kind of practiced deference that you cannot mistake for anything other than what it is. Ryan had turned fully around in his chair. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. I held their gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make it a choice, short enough to not make it performance, and then I looked away and pretended to be interested in the menu I already knew by heart. What happened next happened in pieces, the way things do when shock unspools gradually rather than all at once. James came back to my table about 10 minutes later, leaning down slightly to murmur, "Mrs. Hayes, your son has sent someone over, one of the servers. He's asking if you'd care to join their table." "Tell him thank you," I said. "I'm comfortable where I am." James nodded and withdrew. I watched him carry the message back. I watched Ethan receive it. I watched something move through his expression. Not remorse yet, not quite. Something more immediate than remorse. Something closer to what exactly is happening here. The couple at the table nearest to mine, a man and woman in their 50s, clearly celebrating something, a bottle of champagne open between them, had noticed the dynamic by then. The woman leaned toward her husband and said something quietly. He glanced at me, then at the party across the room, then back at his champagne. The server assigned to my table, a young man named Thomas, who had been with Hargroves for 3 years and knew exactly who I was, brought me what I ordered without any unnecessary conversation, which I appreciated. He had a gift for reading the room. I ate slowly. I was not hungry, but I had learned long ago that in certain moments, performing normalcy is the most destabilizing thing you can do to someone who is waiting for you to collapse. Every bite I took was a message. Every quiet turn of my fork was a refusal to be what they had expected me to be when I walked out that door, small, dismissed, erased. It was Vanessa who finally broke first. I saw her stand up, say something brief to the table, and then make her way across the dining room. She moved fast, on a straight line, and her expression had settled into the version of itself I recognized most. Tightly controlled, certain of itself, convinced it was about to fix something. She stopped at my table. "Margaret." "Vanessa," I said pleasantly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." She pulled out the chair across from me without being invited and sat down in it, because that was what Vanessa did. She occupied space she hadn't been offered and then made you feel like you owed her gratitude for it. "I may have been a little abrupt earlier. I should have explained better. Tonight is very specifically for people who belong here," I said. "Yes, you were clear." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What I meant was, Vanessa." I set my fork down and folded my hands on the table, and I looked at her with the same even calm I had used when I first walked up to that table and received her little speech. "I think you were actually extremely clear. You told me this was not my kind of place. You suggested somewhere more appropriate for me. I appreciate the honesty." She stared at me. The recalculation was still happening. I could see it, but she didn't have enough information yet to know where it was going. "So I found a table that suited me," I continued. "I hope you're enjoying your evening." "Margaret, what exactly is your relationship with the manager here?" There it was. There was the question she'd actually come to ask. I smiled. Not warmly, not unkindly, but not warmly either. More the way you smile when the answer to a question is too large to explain simply, and you have decided not to try. "Why don't you enjoy the rest of your dinner?" I said. "We can talk later." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stood, straightened her dress, and walked back across the room. I watched her sit down. I watched her lean close to Ethan. I watched his face as she spoke to him, watched the color shift in it, first attention, then confusion, then something sharper. He looked at me across the room, and this time it wasn't the polished, certain gaze of a man who had made partner at Caldwell and Marsh. It was something older than that, something younger. It was the look of a child who has suddenly found out the world is organized differently than he thought. James found me again just before 9 o'clock. He crouched beside my chair and spoke quietly, because James understood discretion the way other people understand breathing, as an automatic requirement. "There's a journalist at the bar," he said. "Petra Vance from the City Standard. She recognized Ethan Hayes. The Caldwell and Marsh partnership was covered in the business section last week. She's noticed the situation, and she's asking questions of the staff." I had not planned for a journalist. I want to be clear about that. I had come to Hargrove's that night without any plan at all, driven by nothing more complicated than the refusal to be sent away. The journalist was not something I arranged, but I had also, over 70 years, learned the difference between the things you arrange and the things you simply allow to find their own shape. This was the second kind. "Tell the staff to be professional," I said. "They may answer factual questions about the restaurant." James gave me a look I recognized. The look of a man who understood exactly what I was and wasn't saying, and nodded once. 20 minutes later, Petra Vance sat down across from me. She was younger than I expected, late 30s, with sharp eyes and a reporter's specific kind of stillness. The stillness of someone who has trained themselves to make other people forget they're being watched. She had a small notebook, which I found almost charming in an era when everyone used their phones. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "I'm Petra Vance." "I know who you are," I said. "I've read your work." That surprised her, which I enjoyed. "I understand you're a silent partner here at Hargrove's." "Not exactly silent," I said. She waited. She was good at waiting. "I'm the primary investor and majority owner," I said. "I've been the operational partner since the original build-out 12 years ago." Petra's pen moved. "And your son is Ethan Hayes, the attorney." "He is. He's here tonight." "He is." She glanced across the room. Ethan's table was visible from where we sat, and I could see that the dinner party had gone quiet in a particular way, the way a table goes quiet when everyone is pretending not to watch something while watching it completely. "Is there a story here, Mrs. Hayes?" I picked up my wine glass, a Bordeaux that Thomas had selected for me without being asked, the correct one, the one I always had in October. I took a slow sip. "There is always a story," I said. "The only question is who tells it first." Petra Vance looked at me for a long moment. Then she opened her notebook to a new page. "Well, I didn't tell her everything that night. I want to be clear about that too. What I told Petra Vance that evening was limited. The ownership of the restaurant, the fact of my financial history with it, and a few factual statements about my background that were a matter of record anyway. I didn't use words like betrayal or humiliation. I didn't describe what Vanessa had said to me when I walked in. I didn't need to. Because by the time Petra was writing in that notebook, Ethan had stood up from his table. I could see him across the room, and he was standing in that very specific way that tall men stand when they're trying to hold something together that is coming apart, rigid through the shoulders, jaw tight, eyes scanning the room like they're looking for an exit that doesn't exist. He had figured out what he was sitting in the middle of. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Enough to know that the woman he had let be, turned away at the door of this restaurant, was not the woman they had all decided she was. Vanessa was still seated. I watched her reach for her wine glass and find it empty. I watched her look around for the server, and I watched the server. Thomas, specifically, who knew exactly who to prioritize in this room, be somewhere else entirely. Ryan was the one who finally stood and walked toward me. He crossed the dining room slowly, hands in his pockets, the way he had always moved when he was bracing for something he hadn't figured out yet how to handle. He looked, in that moment, very much like the 8-year-old boy who used to come find me in the kitchen after he'd done something wrong. Not to confess, never that directly, but to hover at the edge of my attention until I acknowledged him. He stopped beside my table, looked at Petra Vance, looked back at me. "Mom," he said. Just that. The same way Ethan had said it on the phone, clipped and insufficient. "Ryan," I said, Can we talk?" "I'm in the middle of something," I said, and I turned back to Petra Vance with the unhurried ease of a woman who has nowhere else to be and no one to apologize to. Ryan stood there for another moment. Then he went back. It was just after 10 when I finally stood up from table 4. Thomas helped me with my coat, and James walked me to the door himself, the way he always did. I heard the dining room quiet slightly as I moved through it. Not dramatically, not like a scene in a film, just the ordinary human stillness that happens when a room has been tracking something all night and the thing is now ending. Ethan met me at the door. He had followed me from the table. I heard him before I saw him, his footsteps quick and purposeful on the floor behind me. When I turned, his face was doing something complicated that I couldn't entirely read. It had too many things in it at once. The residue of the party evening he'd been having, something that was beginning to look like alarm, and underneath all of it, very far underneath, something that might have been shame. "Mom," he said. Third time tonight, that single word. "We need to talk." "We do," I agreed. "You own this place." "I do." He looked at me, really looked at me, which was something he had stopped doing a long time ago. "For how long?" 12 years, I said. "Since before you passed the bar exam." I watched that land on him, watched the arithmetic of it working through his expression. 12 years, the timeline of it. What else might be connected to those 12 years? What else he might not know? "Why didn't you—" He stopped, started again. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I looked at my son, my eldest, the one I had worked 3 jobs to send to university, the one I had sewn Halloween costumes for at midnight because I couldn't afford to buy them, the one who had stood 20 feet away tonight while his wife told me there was no place for me here, and I felt the full weight of the answer to that question. "Because I wanted to find out," I said quietly, "whether it mattered." He stared at me. "Whether any of it mattered," I said. "Without the money, without what I could give you, just me." The thing on his face that might have been shame got larger, more recognizable. "Ethan," I said, and I kept my voice very calm, the way I had kept it calm all night, the way I had kept it calm for years. "I found out." I buttoned my coat. I nodded to James, who held the door. I walked out of Hargrove's into the October night, and the air was cool and sharp and clean, and behind me I left my son standing in the entrance of a restaurant that I owned, with the full weight of what he had allowed tonight settling on his shoulders like something he wouldn't be putting down any time soon. I did not look back. I had spent enough of my life looking back. The drive home that night took 22 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock on the dashboard the whole way, the green numbers ticking forward in the dark. And I focused on them the way you focus on something small and specific when the larger thing is too much to hold all at once. My hands were steady on the wheel. That surprised me, a little. I had expected them to shake. I parked in the garage beneath my building and sat in the car for a few minutes after the engine cut off. The silence down there was the particular kind that only parking garages have. Thick and echoless, the kind that presses against your ears. I sat in it and let the evening settle over me in layers, the way sediment settles in water when you stop stirring it. Vanessa's face. More your speed. Ethan at the door, his voice stripped of its usual certainty for the first time in longer than I could remember. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Ryan looking away. Ryan always looking away. I had answered Ethan's question with the truth, or a version of the truth that was as much as I was willing to hand him in a restaurant doorway on a Friday night. I wanted to find out whether it mattered, whether any of it mattered without the money. That was true. But it wasn't the whole thing. The whole thing was older than that question and longer than that answer, and it started in a place that Ethan had never bothered to ask about, and Ryan had never thought to wonder at, and both of them had taken entirely for granted for their entire adult lives. I got out of the car. I rode the elevator up to the 14th floor. I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, and the familiar smell of the place, old books, the faint cedar of the closet near the entrance, something faintly floral from the diffuser in the living room, settled around me like a hand on my shoulder. I sat down in the chair by the window. The city was spread below me, lit and indifferent, and I looked at it for a long time, and I went back. The way I always went back when I needed to understand where I was by remembering where I had come from. I was 24 years old when I married Robert Hayes. He was 27, handsome in the uncomplicated way of men who don't think too much about being handsome. And he had a laugh that filled rooms and a generosity that was genuine and total and, as I would eventually understand, completely unsustainable. Robert gave everything he had to everyone who asked, and he never learned to stop. And that quality that had made me love him in the beginning was the same quality that slowly, quietly, took everything we'd built together and let it drain away through his open hands. He wasn't a bad man. I want to be careful about that because my sons grew up with a complicated grief about their father, and I never wanted to add to it. Robert Hayes was a genuinely good man who was also genuinely bad with money, and those two things coexisted in him without contradiction and without any apparent awareness on his part that one of them was going to eventually cost us everything. When Ethan was 9 and Ryan was 6, Robert made a business decision. The third of its kind. The third time we had leveraged what we had on something that was going to change everything. The third time that everything did change, just not in the direction he'd promised. We lost the house in Millfield. We lost the car. We lost the savings account that I had been quietly feeding for 4 years while Robert was doing his leveraging. The account he didn't know about. The one I had opened in my name only because some instinct that I couldn't have articulated at 29 told me that having something he didn't know about might matter someday. Even that wasn't enough. We moved into a rental in a neighborhood I won't name because the name still sits wrong in my chest, and Robert spent 6 months trying to rebuild, and then one morning in March, he had a heart attack in the parking lot of a hardware store, and he was gone before the ambulance arrived. He was 41 years old. I was 38. Ethan was 12. Ryan was 9. I have never in my life before or since felt the specific quality of fear that I felt in the hospital waiting room when the doctor came through the door, and I knew, before he opened his mouth, before he said a word, I knew by the way he walked that the news was the kind that rearranges everything. I sat in that plastic chair with Ethan's hand in my right hand and Ryan pressed against my left side, both of them not fully understanding yet, and I received the news. And I held my sons, and I felt the fear move through me like cold water. And then I did what I have done my entire life when confronted with something I cannot change. I got practical. The first job was cleaning houses. I want to say that plainly and without apology because I spent too many years saying it quietly or not at all, as if it were something to be navigated around rather than named. I cleaned houses. I started with 2 clients. Women from the neighborhood who had heard I was looking for work and who were kind about it in the specific, careful way that people are kind when they feel sorry for you but don't want to say so. And within 6 months, I had 7 regular clients and a reputation for being thorough and reliable and discreet. Discretion matters enormously to people who employ housekeepers, and I understood that early. The things you learn about a family when you clean their home, the bills on the kitchen counter, the medications in the bathroom cabinet, the photographs that get turned face down, the arguments that are still audible in the residue of a room, those things belong to them, and I treated them that way. I never gossiped. I never compared. I showed up on time. I did the work. I left things better than I found them. I picked up a second job after 8 months, evening shifts at a hotel downtown, linen service, 4 nights a week. I was home by midnight, up at 6:30 to get the boys ready for school. On the nights I worked the hotel, a neighbor named Carol watched the boys for 2 hours until they were old enough that I trusted them to manage on their own. I paid Carol in cash and in the form of baked goods because Carol was 63 and on a fixed income and appreciated both. I was tired in a way that I cannot fully describe. Not the tired that comes from a hard day, the tired that lives in your bones, that moves with you, that is there when you wake up before you've done anything yet to earn it. That kind of tired, the kind that becomes the weather of your life rather than a temporary condition. But here's what I also had, underneath the tired. I had a mind that worked differently than most people expected when they looked at a woman cleaning their kitchen. I had always been good with numbers, not in a formal way. I had never studied finance or accounting or anything like it, but I understood intuitively the logic of money, how it moved, how it compounded, how small, consistent actions in one direction accumulated into something large and directional over time. My mother had understood it too, in her way. She had kept a savings envelope in the bottom of a tea tin her entire married life, adding to it whenever she could, never mentioning it. I found it after she died, $3,000 in cash, which was more than anyone thought she had because no one had thought to look. I started with $50 a month. That was what I could spare after rent, utilities, groceries, the boys' school costs, and the miscellaneous expenses that arrived without warning the way they always do when money is tight. A broken shoe, a school field trip, a visit to the doctor. $50 a month, set aside in an account at a credit union on Denham Street that I opened in my own name, the way I had opened that savings account before Robert died. I did not tell Ethan and Ryan. This wasn't deception. They were children, and children don't need to know the mechanics of their mother's finances. But the habit of not telling them, the habit of keeping my financial life separate and private, that habit took root in those early years, and it grew alongside everything else. After 3 years, I had accumulated enough to make a small investment. A friend of Carol's husband was selling a stake in a commercial laundry operation, the kind that serviced hotels and restaurants. And the price was low because the business had hit a rough patch, and the owner needed cash quickly. I spent 2 weeks looking at the numbers, the kind of looking that other people might have hired someone to do, but that I did myself at the kitchen table after the boys were asleep. The rough patch was real but survivable. The underlying business was sound. I bought in with what I had. It cost me 3 years of $50 monthly deposits and most of what I'd managed to put aside beyond that. 18 months later, I sold that stake for 3 times what I had paid. I don't tell this story to make it sound inevitable or heroic, because it wasn't either of those things. It was slow and it was imperfect, and there were failures along the way that I don't discuss because they still embarrass me, investments that went wrong, and years where the growth stalled, and moments where I looked at the numbers and wondered if I was fooling myself. If all of this careful accumulation was just an elaborate way of pretending to have control over something I didn't. But I kept going. That was the one thing I never stopped doing. I kept going. The cleaning work continued for 13 years. I want that to sit for a moment. 13 years. Ethan was in his second year of law school before I cleaned my last house, and even then I stopped not because I had become wealthy enough to retire from it, but because my knees had begun to give me trouble, and my doctor used the word deterioration in a tone that suggested I take it seriously. I stopped the hotel work after 11 years for similar reasons. By then I had interests in 4 different businesses. Nothing dramatic. A stake in the commercial laundry, which I had reinvested after the first sale, a partial ownership in a small property management company on the east side of the city, a quiet investment in a restaurant supply company that a woman named Eleanor Marsh had started out of her garage and grown into something real, and the largest commitment I had made up to that point, a significant stake in the early development of what would become Hargrove's. The restaurant had been James Whitfield's idea. He had come to me through Eleanor, who knew everyone in the city's food service industry, and he had presented his concept with the specific combination of passion and financial literacy that I had learned over the years to take seriously. Most people who came to me with ideas had one or the other. Either they burned with the vision and had no grasp of what it would actually cost, or they had the spreadsheets perfectly ordered and no discernible reason to care. James had both. He knew what he wanted to build, and he knew what it would take to build it. And when I asked hard questions, he answered them without defensiveness. I gave him what he needed. It was the largest single financial commitment I had ever made, and I made it after 3 meetings and a great deal of private deliberation and one long conversation with myself at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, where I went through every reason to be afraid and then decided to do it anyway. That was 12 years ago. But through all of it, the years of cleaning houses, the careful investments, the slow building of something that nobody around me could see because I had never shown it to them. My boys grew up. They went to schools I paid for. They ate food I bought, wore clothes I chose, slept in beds I made. When Ethan needed tutoring in his junior year of high school, I found a way. When Ryan broke his arm at 14 and the medical bills arrived, I handled it. When Ethan was accepted to university and the financial aid package wasn't enough, I closed a gap that took me 2 years to replace in my savings, and I never once mentioned it to him. When Ethan applied to law school, I paid the application fees to 6 schools. He knew I helped. He thanked me, briefly, in the distracted way of someone who accepts help as a matter of course. But he didn't know the full scope of it, because I didn't tell him. When he got into Hartwell, one of the 3 schools that had accepted him, and the tuition was a number that made my chest tighten when I looked at it, I paid it. for 3 years. I did not take out loans in my name because by then I had enough that I didn't need to. But I also did not tell him where the money came from. He assumed, I think he assumed, that I had savings from his father's life or from years of work in a vague, unexamined way, the way young people assume things about their parents' finances because thinking about it more carefully would require a kind of attention they haven't learned yet to give. Ryan's path was different. Ryan went to community college for 2 years, then transferred, and the total cost was lower, but I was still the one who covered the gap between what his aid provided and what the reality cost. Ryan thanked me more than Ethan did. He was always better at the social gestures, but his gratitude had the same texture as his brother's. It was surface, not substance. It was said and then set aside like a box ticked. I told myself this was normal. I told myself this was what children were like, and that they would grow into understanding, that the day would come when they'd look back and see it clearly. I had heard that from other mothers, had read it in the kind of books I picked up at library sales, had told myself as a kind of steady, repeating promise. They'll understand eventually. Give it time. I gave it time. What I got in return, as the years passed, was something different from understanding. The first time I felt it, really felt it, not as a vague unease but as a specific named thing, was at Ethan and Vanessa's wedding. It was 6 years ago, and it was a beautiful event, the kind that costs more than most people earn in a year. And Ethan had come to me 2 months before and told me the number with the specific tone of a man who is telling you something he expects to be handled. Not asked, told. Vanessa's parents are covering half, he said, as though this were context I needed to understand the reasonableness of what he was about to say. We need the rest. The rest was $48,000. I gave it to him. I didn't give it immediately. I sat with it for a week. I thought about it. I had one conversation with him where I said gently that the number was significant and asked whether they had considered a smaller event. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before and haven't forgotten since. Not angry, not demanding, but something almost like surprise, as if the question itself was unexpected, as if it had genuinely not occurred to him that I might need to consider it. Mom, he said, it's our wedding. I gave him the $48,000. Ryan came to me 8 months later about a down payment on an apartment. He was sheepish about it, which I appreciated. Ryan had always been better at the performance of gratitude than Ethan, even when the substance wasn't different. And he started the conversation with a long preamble about having tried other options and not wanting to ask but not knowing who else to turn to. The preamble went on long enough that I understood it was rehearsed. The number he needed was $22,000. I gave it to him. That was the year I started to see it clearly. Not the requests. I had been handling requests for decades, but the shape of what was underneath them. My sons had built their lives on a foundation they did not see. The education, the weddings, the apartments, the quiet fill-in on the years when something cost more than they could manage. All of it ran through me, invisible to them the way the foundation of a building is invisible to the people who live above it. They walked around on what I had built without knowing it was there, without asking how it held, without any particular curiosity about the structure that kept everything upright. And when I was no longer useful to them in the immediate, obvious way, when the big requests had been made and the events had been financed and the children had what they needed to run their comfortable lives, what was left of me in their minds was something considerably smaller than what I had actually been. What was left was an old woman who lived in an apartment and had done housekeeping work most of her life and was, if she was being honest with herself, not really relevant to the world they'd built for themselves. That was what I had become to them. That was the thing I sat with in my apartment in the years after both boys were settled and the calls became shorter and the visits became rarer and the invitations began to arrive with the specific quality of afterthought. The conversation about the nursing facility happened 8 months before the night at Hargrove's. I had gone to Ethan and Vanessa's house for Sunday lunch, an occasion that had become monthly in theory and sporadic in practice, usually rescheduled twice before it actually happened. Vanessa had made something that was clearly more effort than her usual, and the table was set nicely, and for the first hour it felt almost like what I had always wanted family to feel like. Then Ethan said he wanted to talk about the future. That phrase, the future. Spoken in the measured, reasonable tone he used in the courtroom, the tone that said, I have thought about this carefully, and the conclusion is already reached. I am simply being courteous enough to narrate it to you. We've been thinking, he said. We, always we, Vanessa's influence in every sentence, even when she wasn't the one speaking, about what makes sense as you get older. You're not getting any younger, Mom. The apartment's a lot for one person, and with your health, my health is fine, I said. Your knee, Vanessa said from across the table, the way you mention an inconvenient fact. My knee is managed. There's a really wonderful facility on the north side, Ethan continued, as if I hadn't spoken. Lakeview Gardens. We looked it over. It's very well reviewed. The staff-to-resident ratio is... Ethan, I set my fork down. Stop. He stopped. He and Vanessa exchanged a look. The quick, practiced look of a couple who have had private conversations about the topic they are now raising. The look that contains an entire separate discussion that the other person in the room isn't part of. I'm not moving into a care facility, I said. Mom, it's not. I'm 70 years old and I am healthy, and I live in my own home and I manage my own life. I do not need to be placed anywhere. Placed. The word arrived in my own sentence and I heard it, and I felt the edge of it. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. We're thinking about your well-being, she said, in her most reasonable voice. It's not easy being alone at your age. These places have communities, activities. I have a community, I said. I have activities. What I do not have, apparently, is a family that wants to be bothered with me on a Sunday. The table went quiet. Ryan wasn't there that day. Ryan was rarely there. He would have looked away. Ethan picked up his fork. We're just trying to think practically, he said, and the conversation moved to other things, and nothing was resolved, and nothing was said about it again until 3 months later, when Ethan mentioned, casually, that he'd put my name on a waiting list at Lakeview Gardens because it never hurts to have options. He had put my name on a waiting list without asking me. I found out because the facility sent me a welcome packet in the mail. I sat with the welcome packet in my hands for a long time. It was a glossy brochure with photographs of smiling elderly residents doing crafts and eating together in a bright dining hall, and on the back was a list of amenities and a phone number and the name of an intake coordinator. It was addressed to Ms. Margaret Hayes in a font that was slightly too large, the way things addressed to old people often are, as though we've all gone blind. I set the brochure on my kitchen table. I made tea. I sat down. And I thought about what my children had decided I was. Not through any single dramatic conversation, not through one identifiable moment of cruelty, but through the accumulated weight of years of small decisions, each one individually defensible, each one adding up to the same thing. An inconvenience, a problem to manage, a woman who had served her purpose and could now be neatly redirected somewhere that wouldn't require them to think about her. They did not know what I had built. They did not know what I was. And for a long time, I had kept it that way on purpose. I had kept it that way because I had wanted, needed, to believe that what existed between us was real, that their visits and calls and table invitations were genuine expressions of connection and not just the minimum required maintenance of a relationship with someone they still occasionally needed something from. I had wanted to be loved for who I was. Looking at that brochure, I understood, finally and completely, what I had found out instead. I put the brochure in the recycling bin. I washed my teacup. I went about the rest of my day. But something had changed. Something that had been patient for a very long time had stopped being patient. And when Ethan called 6 weeks later with that clipped, distracted voice and said, "We're doing dinner Friday at Hargrove's, you should come," I said yes. I said yes knowing, without fully articulating it to myself yet, that the time for being quiet about who I was and what I had built was coming to an end. I had just needed one final push. Vanessa had been generous enough to provide it. Petra Vance's article ran on Saturday morning. I did not plant it. I want to be clear about that one more time, because in the weeks that followed, Ethan would tell people, his colleagues, his friends, anyone who would listen, that I had orchestrated the whole thing, that I had invited a journalist, that I had staged the evening at Hargrove's as a deliberate public ambush. That version of events was more comfortable for him than the truth, which was simpler and more damning. He had invited his mother to dinner, his wife had humiliated her in front of a dining room full of people, and the rest had followed naturally from that, the way consequences follow actions when there is no longer anyone willing to absorb them quietly. The article was not long. Petra Vance was too good a journalist to be dramatic when the facts were dramatic enough on their own. She wrote about Hargroves, its reputation, its history. She wrote about me, my background, my investment history, the broad strokes of how a woman who had spent years in domestic service had built a portfolio that included one of the city's most celebrated restaurants. She wrote, in 2 precise and devastating sentences, that the majority owner of Hargroves had been publicly told by a dinner guest that the restaurant was not her kind of place, and that the guest in question was her daughter-in-law. She did not use the phrase, "more your speed." She didn't need to. I read the article at my kitchen table with my first cup of coffee, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction exactly, and not relief. Something quieter than either of those. Something closer to the feeling you get when you have been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long distance, and you have finally been allowed to set it down. My phone started ringing at 8:47 in the morning. I let most of the calls go to voicemail. The first person I actually spoke to was my attorney, a woman named Caroline Fisk, who had been managing the legal framework of my businesses for 9 years. Caroline was 58 years old and had the specific temperament of someone who had seen enough human chaos that almost nothing surprised her anymore, which was one of the qualities I valued most in her. "I've read it," she said, without preamble. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "Good. Then tell me what you want to do." I had thought about this through most of the night, in the stretches between sleep that had been shorter than usual. I had thought about it carefully, without anger, because anger, I had learned, made you move fast and imprecise, and precision was what the moment required. "I want to review every financial arrangement I have with either of my sons," I said. "Everything. The loan structures, the informal understandings, anything where money has moved from me to them in a form that can be revisited." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant undertaking." "I know. Are you prepared for what it might look like when it's visible all in one place?" "Caroline," I said, "I think I have been the only person not prepared for that." She told me she would have documents ready by Monday. Then she asked, again in a slightly different register, not the attorney's voice, but the voice of someone who had known me long enough to care. "Margaret, are you really all right?" I looked out my kitchen window at the October sky. It was a clear day, cold and bright, the kind of day that looks warmer than it is from inside. "Ask me again in a month," I said. I underestimated how fast things moved. That was my first mistake of the weekend, and possibly my last significant underestimation. By Saturday afternoon, the article had been shared widely enough that it had become a different kind of story. Not just a piece in the City Standard, but a thing that people were talking about on the particular platforms where people talk about things now, sharing it with their own commentary attached, each retelling adding a layer of interpretation that moved further from the specific and closer to the archetypal. The version that spread was, in its essence, a wealthy woman was told by her daughter-in-law to eat somewhere cheaper, and the restaurant turned out to belong to her. That version was accurate as far as it went. It was also very easy to understand and very easy to be angry about, and the internet, in my experience, has never had any difficulty being angry about something easy. I did not look at the comments. I had made that decision early, and I held to it, because I understood, with the clarity of someone who has spent 70 years learning which information is useful and which merely hurts, that the commentary of strangers on the internet was neither. What I did pay attention to was the phone call I received at 2:15 on Saturday afternoon from a man named Gerald Hartley, who was the senior managing partner at Caldwell and Marsh, and who had been, up until that moment, Ethan's professional superior and his most important professional ally. Gerald Hartley was 64 years old and had built his career on an almost religious devotion to the firm's public reputation. He spoke to me for 8 minutes. He was careful with his words, the way lawyers are careful when they are in the middle of saying something they need to be able to deny having said. The substance of the conversation was this. The story had reached the firm. People were discussing it. Gerald was not calling to take a position on the matter. He was very clear about that. But he wanted me to know that Caldwell and Marsh took its community relationships seriously, and that if there was anything he could do to facilitate a resolution that was good for everyone involved, he hoped I would reach out. What he was actually saying, underneath the careful phrasing, was, "Your son's new partnership may be in some difficulty." "I appreciate the call, Gerald," I said, in the same pleasant and uninformative tone I had used with Vanessa the night before. After I hung up, I sat for a moment. I had not thought about Ethan's career when I sat down with Petra Vance. I had not thought about it the night before, or that morning. I thought about it now, and I let myself feel the complexity of it. Because I want to be honest about this part. It was complicated. He was my son. The idea of harm coming to him was not simple for me to hold, even now, even after everything. A mother doesn't stop being a mother because her children have failed her. That's one of the cruelest things about the whole arrangement. But I also thought about the welcome packet from Lakeview Gardens. I thought about Vanessa's face in the restaurant. I thought about the look that had passed between my sons across a dinner table. The silent agreement to let something happen that they should have stopped. I thought about $48,000 and $22,000 and 3 years of law school tuition and 1,000 smaller things that had never been acknowledged. I thought about what it had cost me and what it had cost them. Nothing, and nothing, and nothing. I picked up the phone and called Caroline Fisk back. "Let's also look at the property arrangement," I said, "the one connected to Ryan's building." Caroline's pause told me she understood exactly what I was starting. "I'll add it to Monday's agenda," she said. Mem. Ethan arrived at my apartment on Sunday morning without calling first. I heard the knock and knew it was him before I opened the door. Not by any particular intuition, but by the simple fact that he was the only person in my life who still knocked that way. 3 fast, hard knocks, impatient even in a gesture. I was still in my robe. I had been reading, which was what I did on Sunday mornings, and I had been almost comfortable, which was a thing I was learning not to take for granted. I opened the door. He looked like he hadn't slept. The particular polish he carried so naturally, the good clothes, the careful grooming, the air of a man in control of his environment, was not entirely gone, but it was not entirely intact either. There were shadows under his eyes and a tightness in his jaw that I recognized from when he was 16 and had done something he couldn't figure out how to talk about. "Mom," he said, "can I come in?" I stepped back from the door. He came inside and stood in the entrance of my apartment the way he always did. Not quite entering the living room, not taking off his coat, as if remaining near the door preserved the option of a fast exit. I went to the kitchen and poured a second cup of coffee without asking him if he wanted one, because he always wanted one, and we both knew it. I set it on the kitchen table and sat down. He came in slowly and sat across from me. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The apartment was quiet, the way it always was on Sunday mornings, and the coffee steamed between us, and I thought about all the years of mornings I had sat at kitchen tables waiting for my children to talk to me. "The article," he started. "I didn't ask her to write it," I said. "I know." He wrapped his hands around the mug. His hands were large, like his father's. That was one of the things he had taken from Robert, the hands and the posture. "I know you didn't. That's not what I came to talk about." "What did you come to talk about?" He was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who found silence comfortable, which was one of the reasons he had become a litigator. Silence in a courtroom, if you knew how to use it, was a weapon. But this was not a courtroom, and I was not opposing counsel, and the silence just sat there being what it was. "Gerald Hartley called me yesterday," he said. "I know, he called me first." Ethan looked up. Something crossed his face. "He called you." "He did." He absorbed this. "What did he say?" "He said the right things without saying anything he'd have to be held to." I watched my son. "He was telling you something, Ethan, through me. I would suggest you understand what he was telling you." Ethan set his mug down. He put his elbows on the table, which was something he had been doing since he was 10 years old, and ran a hand through his hair. "The partnership review isn't until March," he said, more to himself than to me. "There's time. If this settles down, I repeated. He heard the way I said it. He looked at me. Ethan, I said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer me. He nodded once. Did you know what Vanessa was going to do Friday night? The pause before he answered was 3 seconds. I counted. In 3 seconds, a person can make a choice about who they are going to be in a given moment. Ethan made his. Not exactly, he said. I knew she wasn't enthusiastic about you coming. I thought she might be a little cool. I didn't know she was going to... He stopped. I didn't think she'd do it like that. But you knew something was possible. I thought I could manage it. And when you couldn't, I said, very evenly, you sat in your chair. He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. The answer was in his posture, in the way his shoulders dropped slightly, in the way he reached for his coffee again as something to do with his hands. I sat in my chair, he said finally, quietly. It was the closest thing to an admission I had heard from him in years. We sat with it for a moment. The kitchen clock made its small sound. What happens now? He asked. I have a meeting with Caroline on Monday, I said. We're reviewing the financial arrangements. He went still. What financial arrangements? The ones between us. The ones I've been part of over the years. I kept my voice steady. I should have done it sooner, actually. I should know the shape of things. Mom. His voice had changed. Something underneath the exhaustion and the careful contrition had shifted. What does that mean? What are you... It means I'm looking at it, I said. That's all I'm saying right now. He stared at me. And for the first time in a very long time, both, perhaps the first time in his adult life, my son was looking at me the way you look at something when you finally understand you don't know what it is. He left 20 minutes later. He didn't finish his coffee. Well, the meeting with Caroline on Monday lasted 4 hours. I had known the broad contours of my own finances, obviously. I had built them, managed them, watched them for decades. But seeing it laid out formally, with Caroline's clear professional narration tracking each arrangement chronologically, was a different experience than living it. It was like seeing a map of a place you've spent years walking through. The landscape was familiar, the shape of it was new. Ethan's law school tuition, 3 years, paid in full from my personal accounts, never formalized as a loan. Ethan and Vanessa's wedding contribution, $48,000, gifted with no written agreement. The down payment assistance on their first home, $31,000, also never formalized. The refinancing of their mortgage 2 years ago, when interest rates had risen and they'd needed capital to restructure, $23,000, presented and received as a loan with a repayment schedule that had never been activated. Ryan's education gap funding over 3 years. Ryan's apartment down payment. Ryan's car loan, co-signed when his credit was insufficient, a co-signature that I was still technically on. The informal transfer 18 months ago when Ryan had called with a business venture that needed quick capital and I had provided it, and he had spoken at length about how he would pay it back and had paid back none of it. Caroline read through the totals. I will not put the exact number in words because I do not think the exact number is the point. The point is that when it was all in one place, when it was laid out in a document without the softening effect of time and distance and individual context, the number was large. It was larger than I had carried in my head. It was larger, I suspected, than either of my sons had ever stopped to calculate. The mortgage co-signature is the most legally complex, Caroline said. The informal transfers are largely unrecoverable without litigation, and I don't think that serves your interests or your intentions. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. What do you want to accomplish here, Margaret? Practically. I thought about it. I want them to know, I said. And I want to stop. Stop. Stop being the floor they don't know they're standing on. I paused. The mortgage co-signature? Can we remove my name? With notification and a 30-day window, yes. Do that. I thought for a moment. The business investment Ryan made with my money. Do we have any equity position? If we wanted to pursue one, we might have grounds. Pursue it, I said. Not to destroy anything. I want them to understand the accounting. I want it to be real to them in a way it's never been real to them. Caroline wrote something. Then she said, carefully, "There's one more thing to discuss." She told me about Ryan's building. I had known about this in an abstract way, the way you know about things you've agreed to without fully examining. 4 years ago, when Ryan and Diana were looking to move, Ryan had found a property, a small, mixed-use building, 2 commercial units on the ground floor, and 3 apartments above. And he had been excited about it in a way that he was rarely excited, talking about the investment potential, the location, how the commercial rents alone would cover the mortgage. He had needed a co-investor to complete the purchase, someone with capital and good credit, someone willing to structure it informally, without a lot of paperwork, because the timeline was tight, and Ryan didn't want to slow it down. I had put in 60% of the purchase price. My name was on the deed as co-owner. Ryan had told me at the time that the commercial tenants were stable and the income was good. He had handled everything: the management, the maintenance, the tenant relationships. He had sent me occasional vague updates. What Caroline had discovered in reviewing the records for this meeting was that for the past 18 months the commercial units had been vacant. The mortgage was in arrears, and Ryan had not told me any of it. I sat very still when she told me that. He was covering the minimum payments from personal funds, Caroline said. But the arrears on the maintenance and the property tax are significant, and the building has declined in condition. She paused. He may have been managing it without telling you because he intended to resolve it before you found out. Or, I said, or he intended to resolve it without you finding out at all. I sat with that. I had given Ryan the money to help him build something, and for 18 months, while that something was falling apart, my son had decided that the appropriate response was to not tell me, not to ask for help, not to be honest, to manage the information, the same way he managed everything he didn't want to deal with, by looking away. "What are our options?" I said. The second wave of public attention came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. Petra Vance had written her article and done her job, and I had assumed that would be the extent of it. But by Monday afternoon, 2 other outlets had picked up the story, and by Tuesday it had reached a national aggregator that packaged it with a photograph of Hargrove's exterior and a headline designed to make people angry before they clicked. The photograph was a good one. The dark stone facade, the brass door handles, the small gold lettering. It looked exactly like what it was, the kind of place that told certain people they didn't belong before they were ever inside it. The comment sections, which I was still not reading, were apparently vigorous. What I was reading was an email from the executive director of a local business association, inviting me to speak at their quarterly luncheon. I was reading a message from a woman I had not spoken to in 15 years, a former cleaning client named Barbara Ellsworth, who had seen the article and written to say she had always known I was remarkable, and she was not surprised by any of it. And the message was so unexpectedly warm that I had to set my phone down for a minute. I was also reading, on Tuesday evening, the statement that Ethan's public relations contact had apparently drafted and released on his behalf. A careful, measured paragraph expressing that the family was working through a private matter and requesting that their privacy be respected at this difficult time. Their privacy. I read that phrase 3 times. Then I forwarded the statement to Caroline with a single line. Please note this for context. What happened on Wednesday was the thing that changed the stakes in a way I had not calculated. A woman named Sharon Park, who I knew through the business association, called me. Sharon was 66, a retired administrator, and she served on the board of the West Side Community Coalition, a nonprofit that managed, among other things, a network of elder care advocacy services. She had seen the article. She had read the follow-up coverage, and she had spent 2 days talking to her board. "Margaret," she said, "we want to know if you'd be willing to share your story, not just the restaurant, all of it, the years of work, the investment history, what happened with your sons." A pause. "We work with a lot of older women who are in situations similar to yours, who are being quietly pushed aside, financially manipulated, told their time has passed. Your story, the way it ended Friday night, it's the kind of thing that could matter to people." I was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about a public statement," I said. "I'm talking about your truth," Sharon said, "on your terms, with us standing next to you." I thought about it for 2 days. I thought about Ethan and what it would mean for his career. I thought about Ryan and the building and the 18 months of silence. I thought about Vanessa and the welcome packet from Lakeview Gardens and the particular precise sound of those words. More your speed. I thought about all the other women who had received some version of that message. Not in those words, not in a restaurant, but in 100 other forms delivered by people who were supposed to love them, telling them that they had become inconvenient, that they were past their usefulness, that the appropriate thing was to make themselves smaller and quieter and less present until they took up almost no space at all. I called Sharon on Friday morning. "Tell me what you need from me," I said. The press conference, if you could call it that, was held the following Tuesday at the Westside Community Coalition's offices. A modest building on the east side that had the specific quality of a place that does real work rather than the appearance of work. There were 12 chairs set out for media, and they were all filled, with 2 journalists standing along the wall. Sharon introduced me briefly and then stepped back, the way people step back when they understand that the thing you're about to hear doesn't need a frame. I had notes. I didn't use them. I told them about Robert, about the 3 jobs, about $50 a month at a credit union on Denham Street, about 13 years of cleaning other people's homes while building something of my own, quietly, because the alternative was to have nothing, and I had refused to have nothing. I told them about the investments. Not every detail, but the shape of it, the decades of careful, private work. I told them about Hargroves, about James Whitfield, about 12 years of partnership that I had never mentioned to my sons because I had been trying to find out whether they loved me without it. I told them what I had found out. I told them about the tuition, about the wedding, about the down payment and the mortgage and the informal transfers and the building that was in arrears while my son told me nothing. I kept my voice even throughout, the same even voice I had used at the restaurant, because I had decided that the only way to say true things in public without them being reduced to spectacle was to say them without performance. The room was very quiet. Then I said the thing I had not planned to say, the thing that arrived unscheduled while I was standing there looking at 12 faces that were looking back at me with an attention I had not expected. "I'm not here because I want sympathy. I'm here because I know I'm not the only one." I paused. There are women in this city, in every city, who spent their lives building things while everyone around them looked away, who were told in 100 different ways that what they had built didn't matter because they themselves didn't matter anymore, who were invited to make themselves smaller to fit into the space their families had decided was appropriate for them. I thought of the brochure. I thought of the font that was slightly too large. I was 70 years old, and my son put my name on a waiting list for a care facility without asking me, because it was easier to manage me than to see me. One of the journalists, not Petra Vance, a younger man from one of the TV stations, said quietly, "What did you do when you found out?" "I decided," I said, "to stop being quiet about who I am." I could hear the sound of several people writing. "And what about your sons?" another voice asked. "What happens to them now?" I looked at the room. I thought about Ethan at my kitchen table with his untouched coffee and his too honest admission. I sat in my chair. I thought about Ryan, who I had not spoken to since the night at Hargroves, who had not called me and who I suspected was waiting, the way he always waited, for someone else to resolve the situation so he wouldn't have to. "That," I said, "is something we haven't finished working out." I said it plainly, without drama, because it was the truth. Nothing was finished. Nothing was resolved. I had set something in motion that I did not fully control, and the people I loved, and I did still love them, in the complicated, stubborn, infuriating way that mothers love sons who have failed them, were in the middle of a reckoning they had not chosen and could not escape. The consequences were already moving. Caldwell and Marsh had quietly suspended Ethan's partnership pending a review of his professional conduct and public profile. The property management company that Ryan worked for had received enough media attention around his name that he had taken a leave of absence, which was a polite way of saying he had been asked to. Vanessa's social media presence, which had previously been the carefully curated catalog of a woman who moved in expensive circles, had gone private, then silent. Their lives were contracting around them. The comfortable, well-appointed world they had built, partly on their own merits and partly on a foundation they had never seen and never thanked, was revealing for the first time how much of its solidity I had been quietly providing. I had not done this to them. I want to be clear about that, the way I have been clear about everything else. I had not plotted it, had not calculated it, had not arranged the sequence of events that had brought us to this particular Tuesday morning in a modest building on the east side of the city. I had simply stopped absorbing the consequences of their choices, the way I had absorbed them for decades, the way mothers absorb things until the weight becomes unbearable and the bones begin to give. I had stopped, and the consequences had redistributed themselves to where they actually belonged. Whether my sons were capable of carrying them, that was the question I could not yet answer. That was the thing I was still waiting to find out. The calls started the week after the press conference, not from journalists this time. That wave had crested and was beginning to recede, the way media attention always does when the next story arrives to replace it. These calls were from my sons, from Ethan first, then Ryan, then both of them together on a three-way call that I let go to voicemail and listened to afterward with my phone flat on the kitchen table, their voices coming out of the speaker like something from a great distance. Ethan's solo message was 7 minutes long. It started formal, careful, lawyerly, the voice he used when he was constructing an argument, and then somewhere around the 4-minute mark, it broke down into something raw, less prepared. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once, in different configurations, the way people do when they're not sure the first version landed. He said he hadn't understood. He said he wanted to fix it. He said Vanessa wanted to apologize in person, which I suspected was partially true and partially Ethan's optimism about what Vanessa was willing to do. Ryan's message was 3 minutes and mostly silence between sentences. Ryan had always needed more time to find words than Ethan did, and on the voicemail I could hear him sitting with the weight of what he wanted to say and not quite knowing how to carry it across the distance between us. He said, at the end, after a long pause, "Mom, I knew about the building. I should have told you. I was ashamed." Then another pause. "I don't really have an excuse. I just wanted you to know I know that." That last message I listened to twice. Shame, in my experience, is not the same as change. I had raised 2 boys and spent 7 decades watching people, and I had learned that the feeling of shame and the willingness to do the work that shame points toward are 2 entirely different things, separated by a distance that most people find reasons not to cross. Shame is easy in its way. It arrives on its own, uninvited, and it can be performed without cost. What shame asks you to do in response is the hard part. That's where most people find a comfortable chair and sit down. I did not return the calls that week. I wasn't punishing them. I want to be clear about that because the line between necessary distance and punishment can look similar from the outside, and I've spent enough time examining my own motives to be honest about them. I wasn't silent because I wanted them to suffer. I was silent because I did not yet know what I wanted to say. And I had made a rule for myself a long time ago that I did not open my mouth until I knew what I meant to put in it. I was thinking. I was thinking about what I actually wanted, not in the immediate sense of what I wanted from the next conversation, but in the larger sense of what I wanted from whatever years I had left and from the relationship with my children that would or would not exist within those years. I was thinking about what was worth wanting and what was too damaged to be what I needed it to be. And I was thinking about an afternoon, 2 weeks after the press conference, when I had visited Magnolia House. Magnolia House was one of 3 elder care facilities that the Westside Community Coalition worked with directly. Sharon Park had invited me to visit as part of the foundation work I had agreed to support, a charitable initiative focused on elder financial advocacy that we were in the early stages of building together. The visit was meant to be an orientation, a chance to understand the population we were trying to serve. I had been to care facilities before. I had visited a friend there in her last years, and I knew the particular texture of those places, the specific quality of the air, the 2 bright corridors, the communal dining rooms with their round tables and their laminated menus, the way time moved differently there, slower and more exposed. I was not naive about what they were. What I was not prepared for was Mrs. Loretta Sims. She was 81 years old, and she had been at Magnolia House for 2 years. She had a room with a window that looked out onto a small courtyard, and she had arranged the things she was allowed to bring with her: photographs, a lamp, a quilt her mother had made, with the careful intentionality of someone making the best of a situation they had not chosen. She was sharp, articulate, with the kind of dry humor that develops in people who have had to find something to laugh at for a long time. Sharon introduced us and stepped away, and Mrs. Sims looked at me with the direct evaluating gaze of someone who has nothing left to be polite about. "You're the woman from the article," she said. "I am," I said. "The restaurant." "Yes." She nodded slowly. "My son put me here," she said without particular drama, as a statement of fact. "He and his wife. Said they couldn't manage my care at home, said it was too much." She looked out the window at the courtyard. A bird was doing something in the fountain. "I had a house, 4 bedrooms, paid off. Been in the family 30 years. She paused. "They sold it 6 months after I came here. Split the money." She looked back at me. "I found out from a real estate notice in my mail." I sat with that for a moment. "I'm sorry," I said. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Be useful." She said it without hostility. It was the most practical thing anyone had said to me in weeks. "You've got money and you've got attention right now. Use it for something. There are a lot of us in places like this who didn't choose to be here, who had things taken from them, who don't have a restaurant to walk back into." She tilted her head. "You were lucky. Most of us don't get a table 4. I thought about that on the drive back. I thought about it for several days. Mrs. Loretta Sims, in 3 minutes, had given me something that neither my attorney nor my business partners nor any of the media coverage had managed to give me. A clear sense of what this was actually for. Not the press conference, not the accounting with Caroline, not the public attention that had temporarily made my son's comfortable lives uncomfortable. The larger thing. The reason any of it mattered beyond the personal. When Sharon called the following week to discuss the foundation's structure, I was ready in a way I hadn't been before. It was 5 weeks after the night at Hargrove's when Ethan came to my apartment for the second time. He called ahead on this occasion, which I noted. Small things, in this period, were telling. I let him in. He came in further this time, actually removed his coat, which he hadn't done the first visit, and sat properly at the kitchen table rather than hovering at the edge of the room. He looked better than he had 5 weeks ago, and also worse in a different way. The sleep deprivation was gone, but something else had moved in behind it, something that sat in his face and around his eyes that I can only describe as the look of a man who has been living with himself more honestly than he's accustomed to. He had been suspended from the partnership for 60 days pending the firm's review. He had told me this in a text message 2 weeks earlier, which was more than he would have done before all of this. Before, he would have managed the information until it resolved one way or another, and I would have found out what he wanted me to find out when he decided to tell it. "The review board meets next week," he said. "I might lose the partnership." "I know," I said. "Did you?" He stopped. Started again. "Is there anything you could do to speak to someone at the firm?" I looked at my son. "Ethan, I know how that sounds. Do you?" He rubbed his face with both hands. That gesture, the two-handed face rub, was something he had done since he was a teenager, and it had never meant anything good. "I'm not asking you to lie for me," he said. "I'm asking if you could explain, if you could tell someone that the situation has been, that we're working through it as a family." "We're not working through anything yet," I said. "We haven't started." He put his hands down, looked at me. "What does that mean?" I had thought about this conversation for 5 weeks. I had drafted it in my head in the early mornings and the late nights, and I had revised it, and I had discarded versions that were too hard, and versions that were too soft, and versions that were about my anger rather than about what I actually needed this to accomplish. What I had arrived at was not a speech. It was a set of conditions, and I stated them plainly. "If you want a relationship with me going forward," I said, "it cannot be the relationship we've had. That relationship cost me too much and cost you nothing, and that is not a foundation. That's a transaction where only one side is paying." Ethan was very still. "I have 2 businesses that need operational support," I said. "The property management company on the east side is understaffed, and the on-the-ground work, tenant management, maintenance coordination, the administrative work that keeps the operations running, is being done by people who are overextended. I need someone there." I looked at him steadily. "Not in a management role, not as a partner. as someone who shows up and does the work and learns what the work is. He stared at me. You want me to do property management? I want you to understand what it means to work inside something you didn't build, I said, from the ground up, without your name meaning anything to anyone who's there. The silence was long. And Ryan? He said finally. Ryan and I are having a separate conversation. What about Vanessa? This was the part I had thought about most carefully, because Vanessa was a different equation. She was not my child. I had not raised her, had not sacrificed for her, and the things I felt toward her were less complicated by love and more complicated by the specific, exhausting effort of trying to understand a person who had never allowed herself to be understood. Vanessa can choose, I said. She can choose to be part of what happens next with this family, or she can choose not to be. That's between you two. But if she's part of it, there are the same expectations. She doesn't get to observe from the outside. Ethan looked at his hands. Then he said something I had not expected. She cried, he said. After the press conference, at home, in the kitchen, she sat down and cried. He said it carefully, not as a defense of her, but as information. I haven't seen her do that in a long time. She doesn't show people that usually. I thought about Vanessa crying in her kitchen. I let myself actually think about it, rather than filing it away as irrelevant. I'm not trying to destroy her, I said. I'm not trying to destroy any of you. What I'm trying to do is find out if there's something here worth keeping. I paused. I genuinely don't know the answer yet. Ethan nodded slowly. He was quiet for a long time. Then, the property management work. Would it count toward the partnership review? Could you write something? Could you document that No, I said. He absorbed that. This isn't for the firm, I said. This isn't a rehabilitation program for your career. If that's what you're looking for, you need a different conversation with a different person. I kept my voice even. This is for us. If it happens to help your career as a side effect, that's fine. But that's not what it's for, and it cannot be why you do it. He looked at me for a long moment. I watched him running the calculation behind his eyes. The one about cost and benefit, about what this would require of him and what it would give him back. The calculation that had governed most of his adult decisions. I watched him doing it, and I waited because there was nothing I could do to change what the calculation produced. Either he was capable of making a decision that wasn't primarily about himself, or he wasn't. I could not make that true for him. I could only make the offer and see what he did with it. When would I start? He said. Shut. Ryan's conversation happened 4 days later, in a coffee shop near his apartment, because I had decided that neutral ground was better for what needed to be said between us. Ryan was already there when I arrived, which was unusual. Ryan was habitually late, had been since childhood, and his being early told me something about the state he was in. He looked thin. That was the first thing I noticed. He had always been the rangier of the two, less solid than Ethan, but he looked like he had lost weight he hadn't had to spare. Diana, I knew from a brief call she had made to me the week before, the only direct contact she had initiated, apologetic and clearly distressed, had moved back to her parents' home temporarily. Not a separation, she'd said. A step back while things settled. Ryan had a coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. He stood up when he saw me, which was something he hadn't done since he was a teenager, and I had made him practice manners. Mom, he said. Sit down, Ryan, I said, not unkindly. I ordered tea. We sat across from each other, and I looked at my younger son, the one who had his father's eyes and his father's habit of believing that goodwill was enough without follow-through, that warmth substituted for accountability. And I felt, as I always felt with Ryan, the complicated specific love that comes with knowing someone's exact weaknesses, because you watch those weaknesses develop in real time, and were never quite able to correct them before they hardened into character. The building, I said. I know, he said. Tell me the whole thing from the beginning. He told me. It took a long time, and he was not entirely comfortable telling it, which was appropriate. There was no version of it that reflected well on him, and I think some part of him had been hoping we could skip over the details and get to the apology. I didn't let us skip. I asked questions when he elided and waited when he stalled and kept bringing him back to the specific facts, because the specific facts were what I needed him to hold rather than the comfortable vagueness of things went wrong, and I handled it badly. The vacancy had started 14 months ago, not 18 as Caroline had found. Ryan had caught it earlier, but had been convinced it was temporary, had managed the first several months on personal funds, had told himself repeatedly that the right tenant was coming, that the commercial market in that area was recovering, that he just needed a little more time before he said anything. Each month that passed made the conversation harder. Each month of silence made the next month's silence feel more necessary because the longer you've kept something from someone, the more the revelation of it feels like an indictment, not just of the thing itself, but of all the time you spent not saying it. I understood that logic. I didn't accept it, but I understood it. "Why didn't you tell me?" I said when he had finished. Not accusatory, actually asking. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I knew what you'd do," he said. "What would I do?" "You'd handle it. You'd fix it. You'd come in and make it right, and then it would be one more thing you'd done for me." He looked at his coffee cup. "I was already drowning in that, in everything you'd already done. I didn't want to add to it." He paused. "I know that sounds backward. I know it made it worse. I know it doesn't make sense that the reason I didn't tell you was because I didn't want to take advantage of you, and then what I did was still take advantage of you. By letting your investment deteriorate without telling you." He rubbed the back of his neck. I know it doesn't make sense." It made a kind of sense, actually. The wrong kind. The kind built out of avoidance and pride and the specific shame of a man who had been given too much and never learned to build without it. But I understood the shape of it. "Ryan," I said, "do you know what would have made sense?" He looked at me. "Telling me 14 months ago that there was a problem. Letting me decide what to do about my own investment. Treating me like a person whose information and consent mattered." I held his gaze. "Not protecting me from the truth about my own money. Not making that decision for me. Just telling me." He nodded. His jaw was working. "I'm not a resource," I said. "I'm not a fund you draw from and manage around. I'm a person. I needed you to see me as a person." I said it quietly, but I said it completely. "You and your brother have been very good, your whole adult lives, at needing things from me. Neither of you ever learned how to actually see me." Something in Ryan's face broke open a little. Not dramatically. Ryan didn't do things dramatically. He absorbed them slowly, the way ground absorbs water, but it broke open. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Tell me what you need." I told him about Magnolia House and the 2 other facilities in the Coalition's network. I told him about the volunteer program Sharon and I were building. Structured, committed, not the casual twice-a-year charity work that people do to feel better about themselves, but real sustained presence, weekly visits, practical help, the kind of time that costs something. "The residents there," I said, "are people who were managed, who were handled, who had their decisions made for them by people who thought they knew better." I looked at my son. "I need you to sit with that. I need you to go there, every week, and actually talk to people and actually listen until you understand what it looks like from the inside." "Okay," he said. "And the building?" I said. "You're going to work it, with me. We're going to bring it back together, and you're going to be the one doing the operational work. Sourcing tenants, managing contractors, handling the maintenance calls when they come in at 7 in the morning. I'll advise. You'll execute. And you'll learn, in the process, what it takes to maintain something over time." He nodded again. His eyes were wet, which he was trying to manage with limited success. "Ryan?" I said. He looked up. "I'm not doing this to punish you. I need you to know that." I meant it completely. "I'm doing this because I think you're capable of being different than you have been, and I'm not ready to stop believing that. But I need to see it, not hear it, see it." He wiped his eye with the back of his hand, quickly, the way men do when they're embarrassed by the impulse. "Okay," he said again. We sat for a moment. Outside the coffee shop window, the street was doing its ordinary city things. People walking, a bus passing, a woman arguing with her umbrella in a brief gust of wind. "Diana called me," I said. He stiffened slightly. "She's worried about you," I said. "That was the substance of the call." I paused. I think you should talk to her. Not for my sake. For yours. He looked out the window. She doesn't... I haven't been easy to live with this last month. No, I imagine not. I picked up my tea. Being honest with yourself is uncomfortable. It gets easier, but it doesn't get easy. He looked at me, and for a moment, just a moment, he looked exactly like the 9-year-old boy who used to hover at the kitchen doorway waiting to be acknowledged. How do you do it? He said. How do you stay? How are you not just... He searched for the word. Angry. All the time. I thought about it honestly. I am angry, I said. I've been angry for a long time. I just learned a long time ago that anger as a permanent residence is too expensive. I set my cup down. I can be angry and still decide what I want. Those aren't the same thing. Vanessa came to me without Ethan. That surprised me more than anything else in this period. She called on a Thursday afternoon from her own phone, not routed through Ethan, her own number appearing on my screen, and asked if she could come over on Saturday morning. She did not explain why she wanted to come alone. I said yes without asking her to explain because I thought the willingness to come alone was itself information. She arrived at 10. She was dressed simply, more simply than I had ever seen her. Dark pants, a plain sweater, hair back in a way that looked functional rather than arranged. She looked, for the first time in 11 years, like a person rather than a presentation. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had sat with Ethan 6 weeks earlier, and for a moment neither of us said anything, and the silence was uncomfortable in a specific way that I recognized as honesty. The silence of two people who have run out of the comfortable performances they normally use to fill space. I'm not going to tell you I didn't mean it, Vanessa said. I hadn't expected that. All right, I said. What I said at the restaurant. I meant it when I said it. That's worse than not meaning it, I know that. She looked at her coffee. I had decided a long time ago what you were. And what you were was inconvenient, irrelevant, something that had to be managed around. She said it the way someone says something they've been practicing saying honestly, with the particular difficulty of words that don't feel good in your mouth. I didn't think about you as a person. I thought about you as a problem that came with Ethan. The kitchen was very quiet. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I read everything, she said. After the press conference, everything you said, and I sat in my kitchen and I thought about my own mother. She paused. She's 68. She lives alone. She worked her whole life and she doesn't say much about it because nobody asks. Vanessa looked up at me for the first time since she'd sat down. I called her after I read the article. We talked for 2 hours. It was the longest conversation we'd had in I don't know how long. She stopped. I didn't know things about her life that I should have known. Things she'd never said because nobody asked. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was clearly costing her something. I did that. I did that to my own mother and I didn't see it. And then I read about what I did to you and I realized they were the same thing. I sat with that for a moment. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said. I know that's not something you owe me. She wrapped her hands around her mug. I just needed to say it to you directly, without Ethan, because what I did was my thing, not his. There are moments when a person shows you something real about themselves, and you can choose to believe it or not believe it, and the choice matters because it determines what you do next. I had been wrong about people before, had believed things that weren't true, had missed things that were. I didn't know, sitting across from Vanessa at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning, whether what she was showing me was genuine or sophisticated or some complicated mixture of both. But I knew that she had come alone. I knew that she had not defended herself. I knew she had not asked for forgiveness, which people who are performing remorse almost always do, because forgiveness is the thing that releases them from having to sit in the discomfort. Vanessa was sitting in the discomfort. There's work being done, I said, with the foundation, with the businesses. Your husband is part of it. I looked at her carefully. If you want to be part of it, there's room. Not as Ethan's wife, as yourself. I paused. The foundation is working with elder care advocacy. There's legal work involved, outreach, documentation, cases where older adults have had their financial rights compromised. It's not glamorous and it doesn't pay what you're used to. Vanessa had worked as a corporate event planner before she'd scaled back after Ethan made partner. She had an organizational mind, which I had always known and never acknowledged. I can do that, she said. I know you can, I said. That's why I'm offering it. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not the closed-door look, not the calculated pleasantness. Something more uncertain than either of those. More open. I don't know how to do this, she said. Any of it. Being different with you. Neither do I said. We'll figure it out as we go. The months that followed were not a transformation. I want to be clear about that because I have no interest in a story that is cleaner than the truth. They were difficult and inconsistent and full of moments that didn't look like progress and conversations that went wrong and days where I wondered if I had miscalculated entirely. If the offer I had made was too generous for what was actually possible between us. Ethan did the property management work. He showed up, which was more than I had been sure he would do, and he was bad at it at first in ways that were both predictable and humbling. He did not know how to talk to maintenance contractors. He did not know what questions to ask when a tenant called with a complaint. He did not know how to manage a building's operational reality from the ground up, because he had spent his entire adult life in rooms where words were the work and the physical infrastructure of things was someone else's problem. He learned. Slowly, with visible effort and occasional visible frustration, he learned. Ryan went to Magnolia House every Tuesday. He called me on the first Tuesday evening and said, "Mom, I met a woman there. Her name is Mrs. Sims. Do you know her?" And I said yes, and he said, "She told me to stop looking sorry for myself and start being useful." And there was something in his voice when he said it, a rueful, chastened, almost laughing quality, that sounded, for the first time in a long time, like himself. The building work was harder for him than the visits. Managing contractors, sourcing tenants, dealing with the administrative weight of a property in recovery, it required a consistency of attention that Ryan had never been great at, and there were weeks where he dropped things and I had to decide whether to pick them up or let them fall. I let them fall, mostly. The falling was part of it. Vanessa threw herself into the foundation work with a focus that surprised even me. She had a talent for organizational systems that made Sharon Park send me an email after the first month saying simply, "Where has she been?" She was not warm initially. Warmth was not her natural mode, and I wasn't expecting it. But she was present and thorough, and she did not disappear when things were difficult, which was, for Vanessa, a more significant change than any emotional display would have been. There was one evening, about 3 months in, when I was at the foundation office late going over documents, and Vanessa was there too, working at the table across from me. We had been sitting in companionable silence for about an hour when she looked up and said out of nowhere, "I think I was afraid of you." I looked up from my papers. Not of you specifically," she said, with a slightly awkward precision of someone trying to be exact. "Of what you represented. This woman who had done all of this, built all of this, who Ethan clearly still needed in some way he didn't talk about. I couldn't compete with that, She paused. "So I made you small instead." I thought about that for a moment. "That's a very honest thing to say," I said. "I've been practicing honesty," she said, with a dry edge that was more self-aware than I'd given her credit for. "It's harder than it looks." I almost smiled at that. "Yes," I said. "It is." We went back to our papers. The office was quiet around us, and the city moved outside the window, and there was something in the room that hadn't been there before. Not warmth, not resolution, but the tentative, real beginning of something that might become, over time, a relationship built on ground that would actually hold. Whether it would hold was still an open question. Everything was still an open question. I did not know, 3 months in, what the final shape of this was going to be. I did not know if Ethan's career would survive, or if Ryan and Diana would find their way back to each other, or if what Vanessa and I were building across a document-covered table on late evenings was the start of something genuine, or just the most complicated version of the performances we had always exchanged. What I knew was that the question was alive. For the first time in years, the question was alive rather than settled, and settled, I had discovered, had never been what I actually wanted. I had wanted something real, however difficult. I had wanted to be seen, however long it took. I was still waiting to see whether that was what I was going to get. 6 months is not a long time. I want to start there, with that fact stated plainly, because what I am about to tell you could too easily be heard as a story of completion, of a wound that closed cleanly, of broken things that were repaired without seam. That is not what happened. 6 months is not enough time to undo decades, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something I am not interested in buying. What 6 months is enough time for is this: to see whether a person is trying, really trying, not the performance of trying, not the initial burst of effort that people summon when they are frightened and then let fade when the fear recedes. 6 months is long enough to watch someone on an ordinary Tuesday, when nobody is watching and there is nothing to prove, and see what they choose to do. That was what I was watching for. That was the only measure I trusted. Ethan's partnership review at Caldwell and Marsh concluded in late January. I was not told the outcome directly. Ethan called me on a Wednesday evening, and I could tell before he said a word which way it had gone, because his voice had the specific quality of someone who has received a blow they were partially prepared for and are trying to carry without letting it show too much. They had not renewed the partnership. They had offered him an associate position, a significant demotion in terms of title and compensation, though not a termination. He was still employed. He was no longer a partner. "I'm going to stay," he said, "at the firm, in the associate role." A pause. "For now." "That sounds like the right decision," I said. "It's humiliating," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, not self-pity exactly, but the raw honesty of a man naming a thing he would previously have managed around rather than spoken aloud. "Yes," I said, "it probably is." Another pause. "The property management work," he said. "There's a tenant situation at the Grayfield units. The heating system in 4B has been intermittent since December, and the contractor keeps rescheduling. I've been going back and forth with the management company, but they're not moving fast enough." He said it without framing it as a complaint. He said it the way someone talks about a problem they are responsible for solving. "I think I need to go over there in person, tomorrow morning. Would that be all right?" I thought about Ethan, 18 months ago, at a dinner table, letting something happen that he should have stopped. I thought about him now, calling me on a Wednesday evening to talk about a heating system in apartment 4B. The distance between those two things was not nothing. It was not everything either, but it was not nothing. "That would be fine," I said. "Call me after." He called me after. Ryan's building turned the corner in February. The first commercial tenant signed in the third week of January, a small accounting firm that needed ground floor space and had been searching in that neighborhood for months. Ryan had found them through a contact at the business association, had toured the space with them 3 times, had handled the lease negotiation with Caroline's guidance and a level of persistence that I had not previously associated with my younger son. When the signing happened, he called me from the parking lot of the building immediately after, and his voice had a quality I had not heard from him in years: uncomplicated, unguarded pride. "We got them," he said. 12-month lease with a renewal option." "Good work," I said. "I almost lost them in the second week," he said. "They had a question about the HVAC and I didn't know the answer, and I panicked and told them I'd call back, and then I spent 2 days getting the information and I thought they'd moved on, but they hadn't." He laughed, a short, slightly disbelieving sound. 2 days of thinking I'd blown it over an HVAC question. "What did you learn?" I asked. A pause. "That I should have known the building well enough to answer it in the first place," he said, "and that 2 days of anxiety could have been 2 hours of preparation." "Write that down somewhere," I said. "That's a lesson worth keeping." The second commercial unit took another 6 weeks. Ryan found a small physical therapy practice looking to expand. The negotiation was harder, the terms more complex, and there was a week in the middle of it where Ryan called me frustrated and close to walking away from the deal. I let him vent. Then I said, "What does Caroline think?" He hadn't called Caroline yet. I said, "Call Caroline." He called Caroline, the deal closed. When both units were occupied and the mortgage was current and the arrears had been addressed, Ryan asked me to come see the building. I drove over on a Saturday morning in late February. A cold, gray day, the kind that makes the city look like a photograph of itself rather than the real thing. Ryan was standing out front when I arrived, hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at me with an expression I recognized because it was the one he'd worn as a child when he'd fixed something he'd broken and wanted me to see that he'd fixed it. We went through the whole building. He showed me every unit, explained every system, told me about the relationships he was building with the tenants. He talked about the property the way someone talks about something they have invested themselves in. Not just money, not just time, but actual care. At the end, standing in the courtyard behind the building, a small, underused space with old concrete and a dead tree that nobody had dealt with, Ryan said, "I want to put something here. A garden, maybe, or at least make it livable." He looked around it. The tenants would use it if it was decent. I looked at the dead tree, the cracked concrete, the potential in the neglected space. "Then fix it," I said. "That's yours to decide." He looked at me. Something moved through his expression. Not the relief of being granted permission, but something more like the recognition of his own authority over something he had built. "Okay," he said. "I will." It was Mrs. Loretta Sims who gave me the clearest window into what was happening with Ryan at Magnolia House. I visited on a Tuesday in March. I had started going myself, separately from Ryan, on a different day, because the foundation work required that I understand the place from the inside rather than just organizationally. Mrs. Sims and I had developed a habit of spending 30 minutes together when I was there, which I valued more than most of my scheduled meetings. "Your boy was here yesterday," she said. "I know," I said. "He comes every Tuesday." "He's been teaching the Tuesday group how to use their phones." She said this with a particular dry amusement. "For video calls. Half of them never do video calls because they can't figure out the buttons. He sat with each one. Took about 2 hours." I hadn't known about the phone tutorials. Ryan hadn't mentioned them. "Is he good at it?" I asked. "Patient," she said, which was not a word I would previously have used for Ryan. "He doesn't rush them. Mr. Patterson asked him the same question 4 times, and he answered it the same way each time without any face." She looked at me with her direct, evaluating gaze. "He told me something last week. Said he used to be the kind of person who looked away when things were uncomfortable." She tilted her head. "I told him that was a common disease with no cure except practice." "What did he say?" "He said he was practicing." She picked up her tea. I told him, "Good. Keep going." I sat with that for a moment. The courtyard outside her window had a bird doing something in the fountain again, and I thought about the specific distance between a man who looked away and a man who answered the same question 4 times without changing his face. That distance was not geography. It was not time. It was something harder and more deliberate than either of those things. That was the moment, I think. More than any single conversation with my sons, more than any agreement or arrangement or milestone, that I allowed myself to believe something might actually be different. Not fixed, different. The dinner in April was Ethan's idea. He proposed it carefully, by text first and then by phone, which I had come to understand was his new method, checking before assuming, which was more consideration than he had shown in years. He wanted to cook, he said, which was something I had not known he could do. He wanted it at his and Vanessa's home. He wanted it to be small, just the family. No occasion, no agenda. I said yes. I will not pretend I was not nervous driving there. I had been to Ethan and Vanessa's home many times over the years, and the feeling that had always accompanied those visits, the sense of being tolerated rather than welcomed, of fitting into a space that had not been arranged with me in mind, was not a thing I could simply decide to stop feeling because circumstances had changed. The body remembers what the mind has processed, and my body remembered every Sunday lunch where I had felt like a guest who had overstayed, every conversation that had closed a door in my face while maintaining the appearance of being open. I rang the bell. Vanessa answered. She was in an apron, which was such an unexpected image that I had to consciously not react to it. She had flour on one sleeve. "I tried to make bread," she said, by way of explanation and apology combined, And it's an ongoing situation. Did the bread survive? I asked. Jury's out. She stepped back to let me in. Come in, Margaret. She used my name the way a person uses a name when they are reminding themselves to use it. Not naturally yet, but intentionally, which was its own kind of progress. I came in. The apartment smelled like something slow-cooked and something baked, and the particular warm chaos of a home where an actual meal is being made rather than ordered or assembled. Ryan and Diana were already there. Diana had come back, quietly and without fanfare, sometime in March, and the two of them were in the living room in the early stages of an argument about something that dissolved immediately when I came in, the way small arguments do when something more important arrives. Ryan stood up. Diana hugged me, which she did with an earnestness that I had always found easier to be around than Vanessa's control. The bread smells incredible, Diana told Vanessa from across the room. The bread is a cautionary tale, Vanessa said, disappearing back toward the kitchen. Ethan came out from somewhere with 2 glasses of wine and handed one to me with the particular care of someone who has thought about the gesture rather than just executing it. You look good, he said. I feel good, I said. And it was true, which still surprised me sometimes. We sat down to dinner an hour later, all 5 of us around the table that had been set with actual care. The good plates, candles, cloth napkins, the kind of effort that says this matters without saying it. The bread had, in fact, survived, and it was good, dense and slightly imperfect, with a crust that Vanessa kept apologizing for until Ryan told her to stop apologizing and just eat it. The conversation moved the way family conversation moves when it is working, without agenda, across topics, with the natural interruptions and tangents and moments of genuine laughter that you cannot manufacture. Ethan told a story about a contractor at the Grayfield property that was genuinely funny in a self-deprecating way, and I watched him tell it and thought, he could not have told that story 6 months ago. 6 months ago, he would not have had the material, and if he'd had the material, he would not have told it that way, laughing at himself rather than framing himself as the competent person managing an incompetent situation. Ryan told me about the courtyard garden. He had enlisted 2 of the building's tenants, both retired, who turned out to have opinions about plants, and the 3 of them had spent 2 Saturdays pulling up the cracked concrete and turning the soil. The dead tree was gone. Something was growing in its place that Ryan could not identify by name, but described with his hands, gesturing the shape of leaves, the height it had reached, the way it looked in the morning when the light came at a certain angle. You should come see it, he said, when it's a little further along. I will, I said. Across the table, Vanessa was listening to this with an expression that I had not catalogued before. Not the closed-door look, not the calculated pleasantness, not the open uncertainty of her Saturday morning kitchen visit. Something quieter than any of those. Something that looked like a person who has found her way into a room she didn't expect to be welcome in and is still not entirely sure the welcome will last, but is staying anyway. I understood that feeling better than she probably knew. After dinner, while Ethan and Ryan were cleaning up, and Diana had fallen asleep on the couch in the particular boneless way of someone fully comfortable, Vanessa and I sat at the kitchen table with the remainder of the wine and the wreckage of the bread and the specific companionable quiet that I had not thought, 8 months ago, was possible between us. She said, I called my mother again last week. How is she? I asked. She's good. She's better than I realized. Vanessa looked at her glass. We've been talking every week, for the first time since I was maybe 20. She paused. She told me things about her life that I had never asked about. What it cost her to raise me alone after my father left. What she gave up. A pause. I didn't know. I never asked. I thought about my own kitchen table, decades ago. The things my boys had never asked about. It's not too late, I said. That's the thing people don't understand until they almost run out of time. It's rarely actually too late. Vanessa looked at me. Is it too late for us? She said. Honestly. I considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. Not quickly, not reassuringly, but honestly. I don't know yet, I said. But I don't think so. She nodded slowly. That's fair, she said. That's more than fair, actually. Vanessa, I said, what you said to me in that restaurant, I'm not going to tell you it didn't matter or that I've forgotten it. I haven't forgotten it, and it mattered considerably. I held her gaze. But I also know that people are capable of being more than their worst moments. I have to believe that, because if I don't believe that, then a lot of what I'm doing right now doesn't make sense. She was quiet for a moment. Do you believe it about me? She asked. Not in general. About me specifically. It was the most vulnerable thing she had ever said to me. Stripped of strategy, stripped of performance, just the actual question, offered without protection. I'm beginning to, I said. Give me more time. Something in her face softened in a way I had never seen before. Okay, she said. I can do that, son. The Foundation's first major initiative launched in May. We called it the Clarity Project, a name Sharon had come up with and that I had initially resisted and then agreed to because it was in fact exactly right. The project provided free legal consultation and financial advocacy services to adults over 65 who were navigating family financial disputes. The situations where adult children were managing assets without consent, where informal financial arrangements had become exploitative, where older adults had been quietly maneuvered out of their own decision-making. Caroline Fisk joined the legal advisory board. Sharon ran the operations. Vanessa managed the intake systems and the community outreach partnerships with a focused efficiency that had already brought in 3 corporate sponsors in the first month. Ryan organized the volunteer network, drawing on his connections at Magnolia House and the 2 other coalition facilities, and had somehow also recruited 6 of the building's professional tenants to offer pro bono time. Ethan, this was the thing I had not anticipated, had approached me in March about contributing legal work. Not through the firm, which had its own complicated position on pro bono commitments during his associate year. On his own time. Evenings, Saturdays. He had said it with the slightly defensive manner of someone expecting to be told their offer isn't needed, and I had said, yes, talk to Caroline. He and Caroline had developed over the following weeks the kind of brisk professional shorthand that meant they were working well together. She had told me in the particular neutral tone she used when she was actually impressed. Your son is a good attorney. I know, I said. He always was. The launch event was held at Hargrove's. James had offered the space before I thought to ask for it, which was the kind of gesture that reminded me why I had trusted him for 12 years. The dining room was arranged for the occasion, round tables rather than the usual configuration, the lighting warmer, a small display along one wall featuring the photographs and stories of residents from Magnolia House who had given permission to share their experiences. Mrs. Loretta Sims was there. She had been transported in a van organized by Ryan and 2 of the Magnolia House staff, and she was dressed in a way that told me she had put real thought into it. A green dress, earrings, her hair done in a style that suited her. She sat at a table near the front and did not appear to be in any discomfort at being in a room like this, which did not surprise me. Mrs. Sims was not a woman who was intimidated by rooms. At some point in the evening, I looked across the space and I saw Ryan sitting across from her talking, and Mrs. Sims was laughing at something he had said. A real laugh. Unguarded. Ryan was laughing too. They looked like 2 people who had known each other long enough to have an actual joke between them. I stood and watched that for a moment without either of them knowing I was watching. That was when I felt it, the thing that had been building for 6 months, through every difficult conversation and every moment of uncertainty and every night when I lay awake wondering if I had misjudged what was possible. Not happiness, exactly. Something more durable than happiness. Something that sits lower in the chest and doesn't depend on circumstances being good to persist. I felt it, and I let myself feel it, without immediately qualifying it or reminding myself that things could still go wrong. They could still go wrong. That was true and would remain true. But the possibility that things could go wrong does not cancel the reality of the moment you're standing in, and I had spent too many years qualifying my own good moments into smaller versions of themselves to do it again now. I let myself feel it. Well, Ethan found me standing by the window near the end of the evening. The event was winding down. People gathering coats, conversations concluding, the particular gentle noise of a room returning to itself after holding something significant. He came and stood beside me, looking out at the street the way I had looked out at it 6 months ago from my car when the October air was cold and the night had just done what it did, and I had not yet known what would follow. We stood together for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "I owe you something I don't know how to say." "You don't have to say it tonight," I said. "I know, I just—" He stopped. The lawyerly composure wavered slightly, the way it had wavered that night in the restaurant doorway, when he had looked at me with the expression of a child finding out the world is organized differently than he thought. "I spent a long time thinking I had made myself," he said, "that what I built, the career, the life, was something I had done. My work, my choices." He looked at the window. "I knew you had helped. I knew it in the way you know things when you don't want to look at them directly." He paused. "I didn't know what you had been." "And now?" I said. "Now I know," he said. "And I'm ashamed that it took this. All of this, everything that happened, to make me actually look." He turned toward me. "I'm sorry, Mom. Not as a formality. I'm actually sorry." I looked at my eldest son. Tall like his father, serious in the way that had always been his nature, carrying something on his face that had not been there before October. Not guilt, which wears itself out eventually, but something more permanent than guilt. Responsibility. The actual weight of knowing and not being able to unknow. "I know you are," I said. "Is that enough?" he asked. It was the right question. It was the question I had been waiting for him to be honest enough to ask. Not "have you forgiven me," which would have been about his own relief, but "is it enough?" which acknowledged that the answer was mine to give and might not be what he wanted. "It's a start," I said. "It's a real start." He nodded. He looked back out the window. After a moment, he said, "The associate work at the firm. I've been thinking about leaving, eventually, doing something different." He said it tentatively, testing the idea. "The advocacy work, the foundation stuff with Caroline. I think I'm better at that than I thought I was. Better suited to it." "What does Vanessa think?" I asked. "She thinks I should do what makes me feel like myself." A slight pause. "That's new, from her, telling me to do what makes me feel like myself." "People change," I said. "Apparently," he said, and there was something in it, wry and wondering, that sounded like the beginning of a new way of seeing things. I'm going to speak to you directly now, not as Margaret Hayes in the story, but as the woman telling it, because some things need to be said plainly. To you, whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from. I spent decades being quiet about who I was and what I had built, and I want to tell you what that cost me, not in money, not in business, in the thing that matters most, in time, and in the quality of the relationships I spent that time inside. I kept myself small to avoid threatening people who should have been secure enough to not feel threatened by me. I shrank my accomplishments, softened my authority, made myself easy to dismiss, and in doing so, I trained the people around me to dismiss me. That is not humility. Humility is knowing your limitations and working honestly within them. What I did was something else. What I did was erasure of myself, by myself, in the name of keeping a peace that was not actually peace. It was just the absence of conflict, and the absence of conflict is not the same as the presence of love. Here is what I know at 70 years old, having lived the things I have lived. Your worth is not negotiable. It does not go up when you are useful and down when you are inconvenient. It does not depend on what you can still provide or how quietly you are willing to exist. The moment someone tells you, in words or in gestures or in the specific cruelty of a suggestion that you belong somewhere less, that your worth is conditional on your utility, that is the moment you must decide who you are, not who they say you are, who you are. And this, the people who love you should be able to handle knowing your full self, not the managed version, not the softened, convenient version, the full self, the accomplishments and the struggles and the history and the boundaries and the things you will and will not accept. If the relationship cannot hold your full self, the relationship is not what you have been told it is. I am not telling you to cut people off at the first sign of difficulty. That is not what I did. I'm telling you that there is a difference between a person who fails you and does not know it, and a person who fails you and does not care. And only one of those is worth the work of rebuilding. And the only way to know which one you are dealing with is to require honesty of them and of yourself. The hardest thing I did in this whole story was not the press conference. It was not the financial audit with Caroline, or the conversation with Vanessa in the restaurant, or the hours I spent in my apartment trying to understand what I actually wanted from whatever years I had left. The hardest thing was refusing to accept the version of love my children had been offering me, the love that required me to be less than I was, to take up less space, to need less, to cost them nothing, because accepting it would have meant agreeing that that version was all I deserved. It was not all I deserved. It is not all you deserve either. Boundaries are not punishment. They are not rejection, and they are not revenge. They are the lines that say, here is where I end and where you must begin to take responsibility for yourself. They are an act of honesty about what a real relationship requires. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, when you draw those lines clearly and hold them without apology, the people who matter will rise to meet them. My sons rose, imperfectly, slowly, with setbacks and failures along the way. Vanessa rose in her own way by her own path, for reasons that were as much about herself as about me. None of them became someone different. They became more fully themselves, the better versions of themselves that had been present all along, buried under years of convenience and comfort and the quiet permission I had given them to take me for granted. I gave them that permission when I stayed silent. I withdrew it when I stopped. It is October again. A year to the month since the night at Hargrove's. I'm sitting in the courtyard behind Ryan's building, which is not cracked concrete and a dead tree anymore. Ryan and his tenants, two retired men named Harold and Vicente, who have in the past 8 months become a fixture in Ryan's life in a way that says something about what he has learned to value, have put in raised beds and a stone path and a bench where the dead tree used to be. Something is growing in the beds, green and unhurried. I do not know exactly what it is. Ryan would know. I will ask him. I am here because Ryan invited me, not to assess the building, not for any reason of business or accountability or the ongoing work of repairing what was broken, just because he wanted to show me the courtyard in October, in the particular light of an October afternoon, and thought I might want to see it. That is the whole reason. I think about the night a year ago, the navy dress, the walk across the dining room floor, the 3 seconds of eye contact that said, I am not what you decided I was. I think about all the years before that night, the $50 a month in a credit union account, the houses I cleaned and the investments I made and the quiet, private building of a life that nobody around me could see. I think about what I was protecting by keeping it invisible and what I was losing. I think about Robert, who left too soon, who would not recognize the woman I have become. Not because she is so different, but because she has finally stopped apologizing for being herself. I think about Mrs. Sims in her room with the window and the bird in the fountain, who told me to stop being sorry and start being useful, and who was right, as she tended to be. I think about what it means to be 70 years old in a world that has already decided what that means, and to look back at that decision and say, no, that is not who I am. Watch. The afternoon light is doing the thing it does in October, that particular angle that makes everything it touches look like it is being seen for the first time. The green things in the raised beds catch it. The stone path catches it. The bench where the dead tree used to be catches it. I sit on that bench and I feel the solid weight of it under me, and I think, this is what it feels like when something that was broken becomes something built, not repaired, not restored to what it was. Built into something new out of the material of what survived. I have a family that is different from the one I had a year ago. Smaller in some ways. I carry more distance now, more awareness of what people are capable of, less willingness to absorb what I should not absorb. Larger in other ways, more honest, more real, built on ground that has been tested and has held. I have work that matters to people beyond myself. I have Mrs. Sims and Sharon Park and Caroline Fisk and James Whitfield and a courtyard in October. I have a son who answers the same question 4 times without changing his face, and a son who calls me after he visits a tenant, and a daughter-in-law who is learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be in a room with me without needing to manage me. It is not a fairy tale. I would not trust it if it were. It is something better than a fairy tale. It is a real life with real people in it who are trying, actually trying, to be worthy of each other. I earned that. They earned that. None of us were given it. And if there is one thing I want you to take from this story, from everything I have told you, from the navy dress and the brass door handles and the $50 a month and the press conference and the courtyard in October, it is this: do not wait to be seen. See yourself first. Protect what you have built. Require honesty from the people who claim to love you. Draw your lines and hold them, not with cruelty, but with the absolute, unassailable dignity of someone who knows their own worth and will not pretend otherwise to make someone else comfortable. You do not owe anyone a smaller version of yourself. Not your children, not your family, not anyone who looks at what you are and tells you there is no seat for someone like you. There is always a table. Make sure it is yours.